Okay, great. All right, we're on the hour. So again, welcome everyone that's here. Really appreciate you being here today. We've had lots of people email this morning to say they're going to wait and watch the recording, but that won't be nearly as much fun as being here. So thanks for being here. So we talked about this subject back in March, and there was a lot of buzz for us to put together a second presentation. So that's what today is about, is to dive in a little deeper with Mark about confidence as a skill, which I didn't know that was true, but I continue to learn from Mark. So Mark he's been coaching individuals and teams for 20 years. I know he doesn't look old enough to be doing that, but that's what he tells me. So he's a performance consultant for the United States Tennis Association, player development, and Team USA departments. And really what he's passionate about, and what we've had hours of conversations about, is really helping individuals own their confidence, right? So that they can every day improve their lives, but also their performance, whatever their performance may be. So today we're focused on effective self-talk, which is, of course, where we often defeat our own selves when it comes to performance. So during this entire time, the reason we have chat working is if something stands out for you, put it in chat. If a question comes up, put it in chat. Just keep adding to chat throughout. I'm going to be monitoring it. And I know from my teaching experience that when you have a question, if we can answer it right in the moment you have it, it works much better in terms of your being able to retain and incorporate that information. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on chat. And now I'm going to let Mark take over. He's going to tell us something about thought sequencing. All yours, Mark.
Thank you, Mary Jane. I appreciate the introduction. It's a lot easier to have someone else introduce you than introduce yourself.
Definitely.
And with that, Mary Jane brought up a very important topic of self-talk. And it's something that is normal. So if you ever question the conversations you have with yourself, know that it's normal to talk to yourself, whether it's out loud or internal, doesn't matter. It's very normal and it's quite all right. And everybody does it. We also tend to do it more when we're in stressful situations. That dialogue often happens. Sometimes it's unconscious, especially if we're in a high stress environment. The unconscious thoughts are usually past experiences resurfacing. And that often then leads to emotional responses, which probably support the negative thought based on the past experience. And they continue, and we'll get more into that as we move through this presentation. But we often don't realize that there is a thought that produces that emotional response. We get so fixated on the emotional response that we tend to fall into this idea that our emotions are in control. And they can be if we let them, but they don't need to be. Our mind is actually in our control. Our thoughts are always in our control, even though it's difficult very often. We do have control of what we think. And that actually influences then the emotional response. But it's often, as I said, those unconscious thoughts, typically related to past experience, doesn't have to be, that start the cycle. But as we become more aware, and that's one of the keys here, and it's one of the reasons we're doing this seminar series, is to help improve self-awareness we can then take control of those thoughts that are so powerful. This brings up the idea of stress. What is stress, right? Is it positive? Is it negative? You have a thought on that, Mary Jane? As you think of stress, is stress inherently positive or negative?
Neither. So I'm doing a lot of work, as some of you know, with the notion of phone anxiety. More and more, I'm doing one-on-one coaching around that and group coaching as well. And how I explain it is that depending on the level of the anxiety, it is performance anxiety, which is a positive stress. Some of the biggest performers we know will talk about, they've been performing on stage for years and still they get really anxious before they go on stage. But that energy informs how they perform. And I get nervous before being here with you on camera, even though I've been doing it a long, long time. But it's a positive energy. It's not a draining energy for me. It's the energy of being able to be very present in this work.
I love that. And actually, I'm going to address one comment that Mary Jane just made, or one word specifically. Right? When I mentioned our thoughts really drive everything else, our vocabulary is a big part of that. So Mary Jane just spoke about being nervous before these presentations, but then talked about how she's perceiving it as a positive. I would challenge you, Mary Jane, to change that thinking, and rather than even addressing the nervousness, let's think of it as excitement.
Okay.
And here's why, right? What indications do you have that make you think that or believe that you're nervous? What are you experiencing that brings that up?
Worry. So I worry, okay, is the slide deck where we want it to be? And is chat working? Is my camera in the right place? So there's all these worries about the things around this that steal my energy coming up to the 1 o'clock deadline. It's very hard in that space then to focus on something else I'm hoping to get done this morning. Okay. So that's where I think I perceive it as a negative. However, because of experience, I know that once I'm here, it's a positive because I'm not thinking about anything else other than being here.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So you're having a future-based thought, something that's not in your control.
Yes. And
you also then know from experience, regardless of what glitches might or might not occur, or what situations may or may not occur, you'll handle them and it will be just fine.
Yeah, I hope I'll handle it. I think that's maybe where we're going is I'm not always confident I'll handle it, even though I should be at this point.
Okay. Any physical indications that lead you to believe that you're nervous?
No, like I don't have a fast heart rate. It's the lack of focus prior to the event. All I'm thinking, it's very hard to keep my brain on something else while I'm waiting to deliver this or another webinar or get on stage or any of those things.
Right. So that's very normal too, right? Racing mind, increased heartbeat, maybe some sweaty palms, pretty common one.
Yeah, yeah.
Jitteriness, maybe even a little bit of a queasy stomach.
That's probably the amount of coffee I drink.
That's the jitteriness. So these are all very common symptoms of having a demand placed on us that we view as stress. And as I asked Mary Jane earlier, is stress positive or negative? She said neither. I agree with that. It's not. It's just stimulus. How we perceive it can be positive or negative. And if that increased heart rate or the racing mind is something that has occurred in the past, then we tend to view that as a negative very often. It doesn't have to
So
be.
I'm going to ask you a question. So Derek has asked, is anxiety and stress the same?
Well, anxiety is a component of stress.
Okay.
And really it would depend on what's causing it and how you're responding to it. But yes, they are related. They're in the same family, we'll say.
Same family, okay.
So having that experience you're having, racing mind, future-based thoughts, rather than just using the word and saying, oh, I hope this goes well, I'm so nervous, we can just change the thought process and say, okay, my mind is racing. I know this experience. Every time I do a webinar or a presentation, this is what happens. And I know that I've gotten better at it over time. I have certain skills that I've trained and I'm actually good at. So you know what? I'm actually excited. And at first we kind of have to go through that process I just walked you through to convince ourselves that we're excited. But when we learn how to change that whole system and view something like the example we just gave as excitement rather than nervousness, it opens up a whole world of possibilities.
Okay. Do you want me to move to the next slide so you can have your visual?
Well, let me just tap into the stress response explained a little bit.
Okay.
Right? In that it's a basic human survival mechanism, as it says there. And the FFF, if you haven't thought about it yet or figured it out, it's very straightforward. We've heard it all before. The fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. Right? This is embedded deep into our DNA. And it was embedded into us as we first began walking upright, because it truly was about survival at that time.
Okay.
So when danger arose, in most cases, it was a life or death situation. And that's just, as we've evolved over time, that component has really, in a lot of cases, done us very well because it keeps us safe. However, when we're talking about performance situations, we want to learn to train the fight mechanism and override the flight or the freeze experience. Because in a performance setting, whether it's in where I spend most of my time, a sporting field or a court or a gym, an athlete may perceive danger, but they're really not in any actual danger.
Okay.
And in a business setting, right, maybe you're going on a job interview and you really need a job. You're going to experience some of that fight, flight, or freeze as you're in the waiting room, or you walk in and have the initial handshake, or within the interview environment. That is going to activate the stress response for sure. Yeah. Doing a presentation like this, asking for someone to sign on the dotted line if you're a salesperson. Right? All of these are different presentations, performances really, and they elicit a certain amount of stress. But with training, we can learn, like I said, override the flight or the freeze component and tap into the fight component. I think the best example of it are first responders, firefighters in particular.
Sure.
Right? Most people were not born with this ability to run into a burning situation. And there might be one or two that just how they're wired, and thank God for them, right? But the majority of firefighters had to be taught how to do that. And in order to be taught how to do it, it's to build through progressions certain skill sets.
Okay.
Understanding the evolution of a fire, the safety precautions, how a fire is going to behave and how they can respond. And through knowledge and the development of skills and abilities, they've learned to activate that fight response and go take care of business. So the challenge is, even though we're talking about managing the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome and tapping into the fight syndrome for our purposes of performance, when we're experiencing that stress response, whether it's a real situation or it's just a perceived one in our mind, it's still very real for us.
Yes.
It's very personal in that moment. And that could be very challenging.
Okay.
But we can override the system. And one of the ways, as I just mentioned, is to learn more skills, rely on the abilities that we've gained over time through experience and through success. So we can then tap into it. And to Mary Jane's example earlier, she's done seminars and talks many, many, many times, still gets a little bit, we'll say, tight before, uneasy possibly, but she comes back to, I know I can do this. I've done it before. I've earned my way here. But that experience she's having of not knowing, is it going to go off well, and worrying a little bit, that actually brings her attention to detail into focus. And she can think a little more clearly in the situation. So one of the ways to override that system is to understand what's happening. When it comes to performance, there's actually a stress cycle. And I alluded to it earlier, but now that you see a picture of it, maybe it'll make more sense. First, there is a demand, a pressure, a stress of some sort that is placed on us, or a situation that we're in. And in most cases, it's not in our control. Sometimes it might be, depending on what it is, but in most cases, it's not. It just is, right? And that then activates a thought, which comes back to what I mentioned earlier. It could be a conscious thought or an unconscious thought. And with more awareness training, we can learn to be more conscious of what those thoughts are. But in any case, there's a thought that leads us then to a response. The response is either going to be emotional or physical or both, right? Like I mentioned, the physical response is sweaty palms, increased heart rate. That's a normal reaction to a demand, a stress, if you will. And the body doesn't know if it's positive or negative. The body is just preparing for action.
Right.
And emotionally, same thing. We might have a feeling of nervousness, but with training, is it really nervousness or is it excitement? Then we can learn to manage that. But initially, there's going to be an emotion. And very often when it comes to stress, we mostly view stress as negative. By the way, stress can be positive. Positive stress is called eustress. Negative stress is called distress. And most people tend to view stress as a negative. So as we move through that cycle and we have the response after the thought occurs, then our behavior or our performance level in any situation is going to be impacted in either a helpful way or maybe a less helpful way. And if it's a less helpful way, if this has been a negative cycle so far, as all cycles do, they continue.
Right.
Once we get through that performance aspect, if we didn't perform the way you wanted to, or we didn't behave in a way that we wanted to or hoped to, that brings our attention back to the original demand. And if this whole cycle was somewhat negative, that demand now becomes highlighted and the whole thing starts over again. And often it's going to be a little more, well, it could be the same thing over again, but if it didn't go well, when our attention comes back to the demand, it can actually be highlighted, and then the whole process actually
Repeats
itself with more intensity.
Okay. So Mark and I have put together two examples. One is Mark's personal example, and one is my personal example of how we've gone through this experience. And so we're going to share those with you. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I know some of you didn't hear this, we're going to get you to do a little exercise. So I'm hoping you have pen and paper nearby. So first is Mark's stress cycle based from, from tennis.
Perfect. And this is a relatively simplistic one, but very real nonetheless. And this is actually an actual player's example. So this is a real example. So demand might be windy, and the player doesn't like who they were paired up against on the draw sheet. Okay, pretty straightforward. Of course, demands can be more or less complicated. We're going to go up this just for the purpose of explanation and simplicity. That then leads to thoughts. Oh, can't play in the wind. Every time it's windy, I make mistakes. I mishit the ball. I lose every match when it's windy. This is terrible. And then I played this guy so many times before. I've never beat him. This is just not going to go well, right? Those thoughts right there are firing off all kinds of chemical reactions in the body, the stress response, the hormonal response, as far as the emotional response goes now. So now we get this increase in cortisol, stress hormone, decrease in testosterone, and we're going to have less energy because we've already convinced ourselves that we can't play in the wind, and we're going to get easily shaken. Our confidence can be easily shaken, frustrated pretty easily, which we don't manage frustration, leads to anger because we've never beat this guy before, and then we're going to make some pretty poor decisions out on the court, despite what we know we can do and what we have done many times. And we're going to lack commitment to the execution of the game plan, which then brings us back to the top. And now, oh, I knew I couldn't play in the wind. This is just
Right.
terrible. I just want to get off right, and that just continues.
So that makes sense. What you said earlier about once you go through this, unless you break the cycle, the next time it happens, the reactions are even stronger because your original thoughts are being enforced.
Amplified.
Okay. All right.
So quick example there, just running through it. Now, this was actually done as a reflection after a match. A stress cycle like this can also be used as preparation, which does lead into confidence. But first, we need to know where we're coming from. So as a reflection, I sat with this player, and after the match, we debriefed and said, okay, well, what were the demands you were facing? And this is what they came up with. And then we went through and filled in the rest. And we'll come back to what we did next after Mary Jane's example.
Okay. So my example, this goes back a long way, but it goes back to starting my first business and having never sold anything and ending up being the person who was going to create the revenue. And it was crazy stressful. I had, perhaps foolishly, but I don't know, I'm here now, so it's all good. I had put a mortgage on my home to start that first business. And, I was 27 and I had a lot of optimism about how this was going to work. So the demand was, I have to sell. Like, I don't have a choice here. I have to do this. I have to start creating revenue. Okay. Well, I'd never experienced that demand before. I'd had a job. Somebody else was, cutting the check, so to speak. So the thoughts that went along with that were, I have no idea what I'm doing. And that was true because I had spent a lot of time on the phone as a journalist. So my belief was if I called people and I had a great conversation with them, they would buy from me. Well, I had great conversations. Nobody was buying anything. So I didn't know what I was doing. And that shocked me that I had put myself and other people in this position. And I also believed then that I must be terrible at this because I still didn't understand selling at that point. Again, I thought, great conversation, you sell something. Apparently not, because I was having great conversations. So what happened? Well, certainly my energy level would drop, right? What energy I had was all stress related, and not in a performance way, but in a I have to make money kind of stress, right? And my frustration level became very, very high in terms of how do I fix this? Why isn't this working? Probably, and I would hate to have a video of how I behaved, but I probably had a very quick anger response in those days. And my anxiety level was, really, really high. I'm sure I lost weight. I'm sure I wasn't sleeping well. All kinds of things that were not positive for my mental health and my physical health. And so what happens from that? Well, you procrastinate, right? I don't want to make another call because it's not going well. I'm not, definitely less attention to detail. I become very obsessive when I can't do something and I have to do it anyway. I become very obsessive and I ignore everything else, which wasn't helpful. And I missed deadlines around other things because I was so stressed out. So that was that cycle. And of course, the more stressed I got, the less success I had. And as Mark's pointed out, this just created more stress and another walk through the cycle. So I won't share yet how I fixed that because we're going to move on to the 7 steps. Is that right? Have I got it? Is that right, Mark? Or do you want the audience to write out one of their examples for themselves?
Let's have everybody first come up with a reflective example.
Okay.
Where if all of you haven't already, please take out a piece of paper and a pen, and possibly a second color pen, 2 color pens if possible, whatever colors you have available, and recreate the stress cycle without the information we have, other than demands, thoughts, physical and emotional responses, and performance/behavior. Create your own blank template.
Yeah, just choose an example from your own life of a stress cycle that you're having. You don't have to write down too many details, but leave space in between demand, thought, response, performance behavior, because next Mark's going to walk us through the 7 ways to work with this stress cycle so that it isn't a negative and you don't continue to repeat it. So what I'm going to do is I don't know, where am I in time?
12:28.
I'll give you about 3 minutes to do that so that we stay on track for you with the 45 minutes. So just quick, what is a demand?
Remember, demand is a pressure or a stress that you've experienced. It just is. It's a situation that you're in. Well, we're doing this as a reflection, so a situation that you were entering into.
Yeah, and maybe let me know in chat once you've got something written down that you can work with. What are the thoughts that come up because of that demand, whatever that might be, a deadline or something? And what are the responses you have? Is it a frustration? Is it a lack of energy? Is it depression? Could be, anything like that. And then how that impacted your behavior around that demand. So just pop into chat a yes or a done for me so that I'll know that we can move on to the 7 steps.
This could get extremely detailed, which is a great exercise to go through for the purpose of this. Try to keep it, as Mary Jane said, pretty top line. Just give yourself the opportunity to just go through these exercise.
Yeah, you're going to get a copy of this deck, and you're going to get a copy or a link to the recording. So just for the purposes of hanging out with us today, Jim Wallace says he's done. Okay, I'm going to wait for one more, I'm done. And then I'll move on to the 7 steps.
Might take people a little while to think about it. Maybe 1 more minute, 60 seconds.
Okay, Margot's done. Kim's done. Okay. Fantastic, guys. That's great. Okay. Wonderful. And Joanne is done. Excellent. Okay. Thanks, guys, for participating. When Mark walked me through this, I was amazed. So I'm so glad that everybody's taking a few minutes to work with one. All right, Sherry, thank you very much. Okay, Mark, I'm going to move to the 7 steps. Derek is done.
Great.
Here we go. So there are 7 steps. So there's 1 slide for each of the 7 steps. And Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. So there are many ways to address the stress cycle and how to tap into that fight response that we talked about. Going through the reflection of your experience and breaking it down into those modules of thoughts, responses, and then your actual performance and performance behaviors. One of the things we want to address is how we talk to ourselves. It's how we began this presentation here. Talking to yourselves in an effective way is very important. I think most of us have probably heard of positive self-talk. I view positive self-talk and effective self-talk differently. Positive self-talk, in my view, are more of the general statements or comments that we might give ourselves. Like, let's go. Come on, get it done. Things like that, which can be very motivating, very helpful. Effective self-talk is what we're going to get into here, which is going to help us learn how to think through how we want to think and talk to ourselves. Remember, self-talk could be internal or external, and ultimately adjust the thoughts in the stress cycle. So here's some basic rules. We're going to go through 7 of them, although the first 3 are really truly the rules. The remaining 4 are more guidelines, like best practices. So the first thing I want to do when we start talking to ourselves, especially in a performance environment, is keep it short, specific. I'm actually going to add an S, simple. Short, specific, and simple. Mostly because we don't have a lot of time in these situations to really sit down and ponder. So you want to keep it pretty short. Specific gets us to the point. It pushes away anything that's unnecessary and gets us right to the details of what's actually important in the moment, helping us to identify what matters in the moment and then committing to it. And if we keep those things relatively simple, we're going to have a pretty good chance of being able to repeat them. So that's the first rule: short, specific, and simple.
Sorry.
When we talk to ourselves, we want to use I statements. We want to keep it first person to make it more personal. I wish I could see everybody, but I would ask you just to raise your hands if I could. When you do talk to yourselves, how often are you using a you statement? You need to X, Y, Z, whatever it might be, right? You need to respond to emails. Oh.
Sorry. I'll come back. There.
And speaking in the third person is a very common way to speak to ourselves. But when it comes to something that's important and something that matters, something that's going to drive an action and hopefully a positive and successful performance, making it more personal is very effective. So learning to speak to yourself in the first person, putting I in front of whatever it is you're going to say, is actually very powerful. Just like some of you that have probably been through some sales training, learning how to deflect or rebut no's when you're trying to sell something, right? Putting yourself I, or talk down an argument or disengage from an argument. Put it on yourself. I am this. Same thing when we're trying to create an action. I statements are important. Okay, third one. That leads us to following that I word with a present tense action connector. Right? I can fill in the blank. I will, you fill in the blank. I do, fill in the blank, right? I can, I will, I do. Statements that lead to an action that's going to drive your intensity level, your commitment level. So that's really important. Those first three, keep it short, specific, and simple. And then I am going to, I gave an example before of looking for a job, right? I am going to send out, you put a number in there, however many works for you. I'm going to send out 10 resumes today and apply to 10 jobs before the day is over, right? Lead you to an action. Now from here, 4 on, like I said, these are more guidelines. So when we do talk to ourselves, our self-talk, as simple as that seems and obvious as it seems, it's not as straightforward. But we do want to be positive and just remind ourselves of what it is we want to do, identifying the vocabulary we're choosing, like identify vocabulary terms with the comment Mary Jane made earlier about she's excited, but she's nervous. Or I said she's excited. She said she was viewing it as a positive, but she was still using the word nervous. Right? Using the word nervous actually brings up feelings of negativity. So an example I gave Mary Jane when we were talking was something that I do every day. I'm a big water drinker, love to stay hydrated, makes me feel good. And before I leave, like many of you, I bring my water, fill up my water bottle, and I take it with me. And most of us in a situation like that a very common way to address that would be as you're getting ready for the morning or whenever you're leaving in the afternoon, if you're that lucky, is don't forget the water. The action of not forgetting the water is correct. Your goal is to bring the water. But it's actually a negative way to think about it. We're bringing our attention to what we don't want, which just increases the chance of forgetting the water bottle, as opposed to using a positive phrase and saying, I am going to put my water bottle in my bag. Or I will bring the water bottle with me today. Something like that, right? Just a pretty basic example, but something I think most people can probably relate to. Essentially, rule of thumb, if there's an apostrophe T, eliminate it. We don't want to think like that. Don't, can't, won't, right? These might lead us to what we really want, but we're opening up the door for more challenges as opposed to just rephrasing that, saying, I am going to pack my water bottle today.
Okay.
Right?
And then, number 5.
And when we do speak to ourselves, we want to speak with some enthusiasm, some inflection in our voice, put some emotion behind what we're saying, because that brings that I statement more front and center and creates more of a personalization to it. So that's really important, right? Just think about it. If you talk to yourself monotone, and again, in your own mind also, it's not going to necessarily drive the action you want as well as it could if you had some inflection there. Get excited. I'm going to bring my water bottle with me today. Right? Seems a little weird using that example, but you understand the premise, I think.
Well, yeah. So it's not like saying, oh, I'll bring the water bottle with me tomorrow.
Exactly.
Versus, I'll bring that water bottle with me tomorrow.
Yeah, it helps drive a commitment.
Okay. Love that.
Yeah. And of course, you want to be kind to yourself, right? Performance is difficult, and we're going to experience setbacks. We're going to experience challenges, to say the least, maybe even some failures. That's normal. It's all part of performing, right? Like Mary Jane said, she was trying to sell, and it just wasn't happening. The self-talk can get pretty negative pretty quick. So we want to reinforce what we know we can do and just be kind to ourselves, right? If we're not going to be kind to ourselves, who is? That's really what it comes down to. Be kind, use some of these rules, all of these rules, find a way for it to make it work for you and readjust. Are you thinking in a way that's really going to help you achieve your ultimate goal? the performance you're trying to execute on. So kind. And then, of course, repetition. Repetition leads to mastery. And that's not mine. I'll give credit where it's due. If anyone's familiar with the former basketball coach of UCLA, John Wooden. John Wooden is was a master coach, taught from a place of character, a coach from a place of character rather than skill or results, and led numerous teams to amazing successes. And that was his comment. Repetition leads to mastery. And this is one of those examples. And if you want to become a better typer, get in more repetitions typing. If you want to become a better thinker, if you want to learn how to override the stress cycle, utilize some of the information and skills that we're sharing here today and practice them. Repeat them often. Repetition, repetition, repetition. And those are our rules for self-talk.
So you're going to have all of those in this deck. And Mark, we have 4 minutes left. So very quickly, if we go back to thinking about Mary Jane Can't Sell and it's all falling apart, what I did first was step back and think about what I understood about selling. In terms of being kind to myself, I knew I had the skill to have great conversations. So I had to change how I viewed my thoughts about selling. And where I landed, and what I still teach, is that I have to let my prospects know I exist. That's all. If they don't know I exist, I'm cheating them out of making the best decision for themselves. I'm actually not in charge of whether they say yes or no to me, but I am in charge of letting them know I'm here and the value of what I do. And so that became my mantra day after day after day. And of course, that was 1988. And I'm still here and I love selling, but I still follow those initial thoughts and energy and change of viewing the task of selling that I created all those years ago. Thanks, Natasha. So it sounds like pinning up short affirmations to be reminded of how to be kind to ourselves and encouraging, being our own cheerleaders, short, sweet, kind to ourselves. Yes, and it's about, as Mark's talked about, interrupting that negative thought. So there's a shorter phrase that Mark and I talked about, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And as those negative thoughts arise because of stress, you need to get in there and repeat the 7 rules that Mark has given us. And that's the whole thing is about practice. But initially, when you have that kind of a stress response, you want to get in between the stress and your negative self-talk and practice turning that in a different direction. And that does, Mark, take a lot of practice.
It does. But the way I'd like to phrase that is, as we've spoken about, the thoughts are the only component within that stress cycle that you actually have control over. So the whole idea is reframing the thoughts, right? Yeah. Instead of using my water bottle example, I won't forget the water bottle. I will remember to pack the water bottle into my bag, right? Reframe the thoughts. And that's why I asked you to take out the second color pen. So now that you have an outline of a stress cycle next to where you wrote in the original color, in the next color, if you were to write down what those reframing thoughts can be, now you can influence how the rest of the cycle might play out. And of course, it takes practice, but then you can even sort of project, if you have those thoughts, how might you feel? And then what might your performances and behaviors look like? And try to rework how that whole cycle is going to go. Now, the response portion and the response portion of the behavior performance portion, sort of a gray area because you don't know how that's going to go yet, but you're kind of creating what you want. But then in a third color, after you have the experience, then you can evaluate those two portions.
Right.
It's the thoughts we want to start with now, just reframing those and giving you some of the rules to creating effective self-talk is a great first step.
I love this. So Linda's added, so powerful. My negative self-talk goes like, why do I do that? Why am I getting so frustrated? I've got to stop asking why and get on with it.
Sometimes, I mean, sometimes digging in and understanding why you respond in a certain way is important to know, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we can just move through it and work to the outcome we want.
Well, yeah. So if you're frustrated, you go backwards in the cycle. So the frustration came after a thought. So you go back to, what was I thinking? What was I telling myself that has made me frustrated? What was the, experience I was having that made me frustrated? And again, it's huge practice. And there's so many of these moments in all our lives around a wide variety of things, that this is something we can actually practice every day, maybe even several times a day. So I'm very, very grateful to Mark for having reached out and sharing his expertise with me, and so that we could share it with all of you. Questions, comments, do put them in chat. We will stay on the call a few extra minutes if you have a question you'd like either one of us to answer. You're going to get a copy of the deck and a copy of the recording. You're going to get our contact information here if you've got questions you'd like to approach us with personally, or if you're interested in coaching or simply want to expand your network by connecting with us. That's awesome. And here are the 7 rules for effective self-talk on one page that you can, I'm going to, as I say, you're going to get a copy of the deck so you could just print this one slide. I will go in and add simple to the first one before it gets sent out to you so that it's accurate for you. So any questions or thoughts or comments, anybody? Derek is adding, after over 30 years in sales, I'm continuously whipping myself instead of looking at what I have accomplished as it is always wanting more. Yeah. And that's how sales feels. It's like it should always be more, right?
Well, I mean, and that's true in any performance setting, right? Whatever we did yesterday doesn't mean a whole lot today. We have to do it again today. And that's the nature of performance. You have to keep producing. But it's natural to kind of view the negatives there. Just the language that's used on a daily basis. Probably a bigger conversation, but society tends to view things more from a negative lens than a positive one. So it's natural to view where we fall short. But when we can learn to recognize what we've done, like Derek was saying, like great successes, and then rely on the skills that we have, the abilities that we know we have, that leads into what we spoke about in the first presentation several weeks ago about building resilient confidence. Great.
And Natasha shared, I'd love to add to the 3 Fs, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, as in FAWN. Learning to become aware of when we respond in any of those ways to something would be key to change our responses and make different choices. Very ingrained in us to move to the stress response.
Great thought. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's great, Natasha. Thank you. Okay. Well, that's the end of the presentation. As I say, if you've got a question or you want to share a thought with anybody on the call, put that in chat. Otherwise, you'll get notice of whatever the next webinar is going to be. And again, thanks. It was great of you to show up. Thank you, Derek. This was incredible. Thanks to you both. I thought it was incredible too. I really learned a lot from Mark. Really, really grateful that he connected. And yeah, we will keep you informed of what's going on in the future for these little half-hour to 45-minute gatherings. In terms of, to me, they all relate to communication. And this was a great way to talk about self-communication. Not something I teach, but something that really influences what I do, just like it does for Mark. Derek saying it's a life changer. Wow. And Margot saying, thanks so much, Mary Jane and Mark. This is so inspiring. Thank you very, very much. That's great, guys. I'm so glad you appreciate it. Sherry, thank you. This was great information. Really like the 7 rules. Good.
Awesome.
Yeah. And as I say, I'll go in and add the simple so that you can print that. I'm going to print it and put it up here in my office. Amy's saying, I will certainly be more aware of inner thoughts. That's fantastic. Claire, thank you, Mary Jane and Mark. This is very helpful. I will take the 7 rules and share them with my team.
Oh,
perfect. Awesome. Okay. Wonderful, everybody. Thank you so much again for being here with us.